So I'm starting to think that Russia might actually want to take all of Ukraine, which sounds crazy, I know, but hear me out. If you look at their actions, not just their words, you'll see that the Russian military began offensive operations in 2 new territories of Ukraine just in the last couple weeks. And it's not just a matter of soldiers moving around the battlefield and the line shifting a little bit here and there. Even Russian leadership, Dmitry Medvedev, former president and prime minister, said, quote, "Those who refuse to acknowledge the realities of war and negotiations will receive new realities on the ground. Our armed forces have launched an offensive in the Dnipro region. Disinfection against parasites continues." So that's heartwarming, to say the least. Now, to back it up just a little bit, first off, the areas we're going to be looking at today, Sumy up here in the north and Dnipro down here in the southeast, the peace negotiations that have been ongoing have been heavily focused on these 5 territories. Starting south, we've got Crimea down here in the red, taken by Russia in 2014, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Russia's demand in the most recent round of peace talks is that Ukraine not only cede all of the territory that Russian forces have so far taken over, but also the territory that they have not yet been able to take. So if you see the outline of the oblasts here, Donetsk, a good chunk of that is still in Ukrainian control. Russia says, nope, hand that over, withdraw. Same thing here in Zaporozhye as well as here in Kherson. Russia is saying to Ukraine, withdraw from your positions, hand over that territory that is internationally recognized as Ukrainian territory, all the Ukrainian civilians to flee, and Russia is going to take that over. Those are the Russian terms, along with a bunch of other demands that were, quite frankly, unrealistic for Ukraine to agree to. But that changed. So, of course, that wasn't something Ukraine was going to be able to agree to. And in the interim, Russia has begun 2 new offensive operations. The first one right here. And again, neither one of these, the one in Sumy, there's actually a fair amount of progress being made. Not as much being made down here. This is more symbolic right now, and we'll talk to that in a second. But if we go back on this map, this is Deep State map, a full week, you're going to see not a lot of territorial change of control, but this area right here is what we're looking at. In fact, I'm going to go over to Syriac map, which I think is harder to read at times, but also is a little more clear in this particular instance of showing the progress the Russian forces have made. And this is what we're looking at right here. Again, not a massive advance. You've got a tree line, and we do have some videos put out by Russian forces showing their advance in some of these areas. It's not like a major, river crossing or anything like that, but it shows that Russia has now moved into another oblast in Ukraine. And that is significant. Again, the symbolism here of Russia saying, wait a minute, it's just those 4 territories in the east plus Crimea, and then you blink and all of a sudden it's, actually we need a buffer zone. So diving into what this operation right here looks like, and I want to be clear, this doesn't look like some massive breakthrough right now, but it does appear that this is an area where Russia is consolidating forces and planning to push further west from Donetsk into Dnipro. Turning to Russian mill blogger Alexander Kotz, he said, quote, "Units of the center group of forces continued to advance into the depths of the enemy's defense and increase the area of liberated territories in the Dnipro region. The day before, the military recorded that units of the 90th Tank Division had broken through the western borders of the DPR and entered enemy territory. The ribbon was broken through west of the Donetsk village of Orchkevo, which I'm butchering for sure, but this village here. So this is the breakthrough that they're talking about into Dnipro. He says, apparently the formation of a buffer zone between Dnipro and Donetsk has begun. At the first stage, the main goal of this sanitary cordon is to cut off logistics from the units and formations of the Ukrainian armed forces holding positions in the DPR. To do this, it is necessary to cut off 3 key routes. As practice has shown, storming large settlements head-on in conditions of massive use of drones by the enemy is a virtually impossible task, but isolating the combat zone, on the contrary, allows cities to be taken with relatively small losses. So, they're looking at some of these territories here, further inside of Dnipro, as the next plan for Russian forces. Again, we heard Putin talk a couple weeks ago saying that the need is for Russia to create buffer zones along their borders with Ukraine. And in some of the areas, going back to Deep State map, some of the areas we expected that to play out, like up here in Sumy and areas along Belgorod and Bryansk, and say maybe Russia's going to try to create something in this area. What was maybe not expected, but we're seeing play out right now, is Russia is also talking about buffer zones for the 4 territories in Ukraine that they have not yet taken. So Russia wants a buffer zone for Kherson. They want a buffer zone for Zaporozhye. They want a buffer zone for Donetsk and Luhansk. Do you see how this goes? It's just a buffer zone. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about pushing into a new territory of Ukraine, even though we've never said anything about wanting Dnipro in any of these peace negotiations. But now we do need it. because it's a buffer zone. It's dangerous for us to be right up against Ukrainian forces, is what Russia is saying. Buffer zone, that at one point, this was a buffer zone, right? Back in 2014, Russia's referred to part of this, the DPR, the Donbass, as a buffer zone between Ukraine and Russia, a buffer zone between NATO and Russia. It's a buffer zone until it becomes taken over by Russia and annexed into Russian territory. So kind of interesting right now that we are seeing movement in a couple different directions. That was further south. I do want to shift up further north to Sumy. More territorial change of control here, but again, the other thing holds true. When you're looking at the territories that Russia is saying are important, it's out here in the east. We're not going to be talking about the east right now. We're going to be shifting up north, northern Ukraine, northeastern Ukraine. So this is potentially one of those buffer zones that they're talking about. And when you look at the territorial change here recently, it's been significantly more than other areas of the front. But just in the course of the last week, and this is why I like Deep State Map, I have no doubt that it's not perfectly accurate. It's probably a day or two behind in terms of the actual progress. But this being able to move between dates, I think is incredibly valuable to see the progress on the battlefield. But zooming in here a little bit more, this is the territory. The gray area is contested, red controlled by Russia. And you'll see how much this has changed just in the course of the last week. So Russia's continuing to advance, cutting off this main route here and starting to push closer and closer to Sumy. We have seen in recent days rockets start to fall in Sumy, multiple launch rocket systems from things like a Grad that does have the range into the outskirts of Sumy up into your Russian forces. 20 kilometers is well within the range of quite a few Russian multiple launch rocket systems, and of course, countless Russian drones. So what we might expect to see here before too long is Russian forces in here start to pressure the population in Sumy, try to get the Ukrainians to withdraw from that area, might make it more tenable for Russian forces to advance. But nonetheless, we are seeing, again, Russian forces push into two areas that they have not brought up in these ceasefire negotiations, in these peace negotiations. They are starting new fronts, is the best way to put it. One in Sumy, and one is a continuation of the eastern fight, but moving into the Dnipro, just buffer zones, right? Now, continuing on, a couple other major issues here. Last night, Russia carried out a pretty significant attack into Ukraine. There were a lot of warnings that this was going to be the biggest yet, and concerns that there could be significant casualties and losses all across Ukraine. And I think what's interesting here is recognizing how used to these attacks Ukraine has gotten, how normal they've become. It was something like 499 total munitions launched between mostly Shahed-style drones, Shahed-style drones. We're going to go with one or the other. And more on those in a second. And then a handful of missiles. We've got KH-22 anti-ship missiles fired from Tu-22 bombers over the Black Sea, KH-101 cruise missiles launched by Tu-95 aircraft, some ballistic Iskander missiles, Kinzhals, a couple Kinzhals were launched, and then just a ton, I want to say 477 or so Shahed drones, as well as decoys that Russia is using more and more to throw the air defense off. Now, an interesting aspect here, a lot of those appear to have been intercepted. According to Russia, they were targeting Ukrainian airfields. No indication. We have not seen any battle damage assessment from that. There's been a couple videos and pictures coming out showing what appear to be civilian infrastructure in portions of Ukraine that were hit last night, and rescue operations underway. Nothing, as is the norm and as is to be expected, nothing confirming any sort of military battle damage assessment. In this case, you would need to get that from Russia. Russia isn't doing anything other than saying, yes, we hit military airfields. Now, an interesting aspect with this, when we're talking about the effectiveness of Ukrainian air defense, I mean, they shot down almost all of the munitions coming in last night, which is not the normal stance. Just a couple nights ago, quite a few got through. Last night, it seems like Ukraine is more effective than they have been in recent days. But one of the systems that they've been using to down those Shahed drones are the APKWS rockets. And this is a ground-launched rocket that Ukraine has figured out a way to effectively engage these kind of slow-moving drones. And they're relatively cheap, significantly cheaper than, say, some sort of surface-to-air missile system. So anyways, a few months ago, or a while ago, under the Biden administration, Ukraine put this forward and said, hey, this is a weapon system we could use more of. And just this week, we got news that that order came in, and the United States redirected that to our own forces. And I have a feeling we're going to see more of this because it's a difficult line to walk. It's a difficult argument to make, but I want to get into this here briefly. So the news was that U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth reportedly issued an urgent call to redirect these weapons last Wednesday. They say Hegseth's order coincided with his absence from the most recent Ukraine Defense Contact Group meeting, the first time a defense chief has missed the conference since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. In fact, this was something that President Zelensky brought up in an interview just over the course of the weekend, where he talks about how they were ready for these. They needed these weapon systems. Let's go ahead and give that a listen.
And we counted on this project. 20,000 between us, 20,000 missiles, anti-Shahid missiles. It was not expensive, but it's special technology. So we counted on these 20,000 missiles. Today in the morning, my Minister of Defense told me that the United States moved it to the Middle East.
Все, що ви сказали сьогодні, не дуже оптимістично лунало, але
And that's something we reported on just a couple days ago. So for anybody watching these videos, that's not necessarily news. The reaction from President Zelensky and the confirmation there is, of course, newsworthy. But the reason I think we're going to see more of this is because it's very difficult to argue with. For starters, we, the United States government, listed this as a necessary item for the defense of our troops. You're not going to win an argument here in the United States at all for somebody to say that if we are short something for our military that they need that could protect our service members, we should instead send it to Ukraine right now. Now, if it's we don't need it right now, or it's a long-term planning, or we've got plenty in stockpiles or production, that's an entirely different story. But the way the DoD framed this was, these are urgent. We need them today. They need to go to the Middle East to protect our service members. It is a losing argument for anybody in the United States, any leadership, any political figures in the United States to push back on that, because it appears then that they are prioritizing Ukraine and Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian cities over the defense, the protection of our own service members, which is why I think we're probably going to see more of this going forward. To be clear, these weapon systems were purchased by the United States. The frustration, the issue that Ukraine has here is that they were planning on it. This had been agreed upon that they would go to Ukraine for urgent use. Of course, nearly 500 of these drones utilized last night. This is an everyday issue for Ukraine. And now they can't count on the United States for those weapon systems, which we have not seen new military aid packages proposed, let alone agreed upon and sent under the Trump administration. There's no indications that those are coming anytime soon. I would expect that we're going to see more of these kind of reclassification of certain weapon systems, because there's no way to prove it from a public perspective. There's no way for us, we can say, why do we need 20,000 rockets in the Middle East right now? It's hard to say exactly what that would be used for unless we got into a significant fight with Iran or the Houthis in the next couple of days here. Maybe that's in the cards, right? But there's no way publicly we can really push back on that other than making a lot of speculation. So I wouldn't be shocked at all if for a lot of the Ukraine aid coming up, because there's still a lot that hasn't yet been delivered, been promised, been committed, but has not yet been delivered. Wouldn't be surprised to see this tactic utilized more and more. Of course, it's frustrating because these weapon systems that they're talking about are ones to defend Ukrainian cities, keep people alive, and let's just buy more of them, right? Or this would be a great time for the Defense Department to come out with a statement and say, yes, we had to reallocate these for a reason A, B, and C. Don't worry, we've put in another order and expedited the procurement so the next shipment comes in next month instead of next year, whatever it might be. Nonetheless, the story right now is that those rockets certainly have been reallocated to U.S. forces in the Middle East. Now, continuing with last night's strikes, the Russian Ministry of Defense, of course, said all attacks were successful. They say the armed forces of the Russian Federation carried out a massive strike with high-precision, long-range air-launched weapons on the airfields basing tactical aircraft of the armed forces of Ukraine in a couple different regions. This is one of the retaliatory strikes to the terrorist attacks carried out by the Kyiv regime on Russian military airfields. So a couple days ago, Russia was all about this. We're going to get them back. There's going to be this big response. They started to get some pushback domestically of people saying, today, like sometime, are you going to do this? Are you capable of doing anything? Finally, they launched what looked like any other attack that they've been doing for weeks and months on end. And there were a lot of people in Russia that pushed back on that and said, my God, guys, just don't call it a response, because this is very clearly just the same thing you were going to do anyways. My guess is they saw that pushback and decided, well, let's just label like the next handful of attacks our response. So last night, once again, albeit a very similar attack to we've seen in recent weeks and months, Russia labeled this also as part of their attack as a response to their Ukrainian attack on the Russian military airfields. This also comes in line with a report yesterday, more and more suggestions, no proof, but suggestions that the Russian aircraft Su-35 that was shot down may have been intercepted by a Ukrainian F-16. May have been. More speculation, no confirmation in one way or another, but the reports are kind of piling on in a way that gives it more credibility than they've had in the past, where it's like one report and then nothing follows. So it's entirely possible that this strike against Ukrainian airfields came on the heels of that. If F-16s are starting to be used more in an air defense role closer to the front, able to shoot down Russian aircraft behind the front lines, like inside of Russian territory, then maybe Russia wants to go after some of those airfields and prevent that from happening in the future. Now, at the same time, Ukraine carried out a series of strikes last night into Russia. Again, nearly every single night now, significant Ukrainian drone attacks into Russia. They say that their their UAV systems forces targeted a defense industrial enterprise involved in the production of adaptive antennas, which are used in particular in the Shahed-type attack UAVs, unified planning and correction modules for guided aerial bombs, and other high-precision weaponry. We do have some footage of those strikes taking place last night from the Russian perspective, talking about what actually hit home. There were a handful of Russian mill bloggers actually overnight getting really frustrated, starting to voice concerns of like, why does this keep happening? How are we not adapting? How are there still Ukrainian drones flying overhead? And that's part of the purpose here with Ukraine carrying out these attacks, is to show Russia, to show their Western partners that they are still very much in the fight. Hitting an antenna factory, of course, helps the military effort directly, but it's also a signal to all of the Russians, right? And say, hey, you still haven't been able to figure this out. We're still able to hit you day in and day out. Now, there was also a interesting report kind of circulating, a couple of interesting ones I want to get into. Earlier today, there were rumors. Again, I feel like sometimes it's worth bringing up these rumors because they're so heavily reported in other areas, but I'm going to stick with that for now, that it is a rumor that overnight, this was a statement put out by Ukraine, their special operations forces, in coordination with other elements of the Ukrainian Defense Forces, struck an airfield in the Novgorod region, and they say that they were able to destroy 2 more Russian aircraft, a MiG-31 and a Su-34. Russia immediately came out and denied this, like through millblogger channels. We haven't seen, I've not come across any footage to verify it at this point. Satellite imagery, right? We'll give it another day or two. Maybe we'll get some satellite images there. But this one was actually put out by the Ukrainian government. And they've generally been pretty good at big claims like this. When they put something out, there tends to be proof to back it up. So I'm leaning towards this being accurate, but of course we'll wait for more information. The one that I'm leaning towards not necessarily being accurate was this hype about a train attack a couple days ago. There looks to be a singular Russian account that said a bunch of drones flew out the back of a train car in occupied Ukrainian territory and started just hammering this entire line of rail cars, where it hit fuel, a bunch of tanks, artillery pieces, things like that. And it was like, a division's worth of equipment all up in smoke. And it kind of brought back these ideas of the Operation Spiderweb, drones being launched out the back of these containers inside of Russia. And it got a lot of traction right away. People saying, oh my God, it happened again. Here we go. There doesn't seem to be any evidence to back that up at this point. Would have been crazy, would have been interesting to see, but there's a couple things pushing back on here. First off, the lack of imagery is a little bit suspect. I mean, again, when Ukraine was hitting strategic bombers on important airfields inside of Russia, there was a lot of footage coming out just from the Russian side, to include some Russian soldiers uploading their own footage, right? So somehow none of that happened at all. We've got no Ukrainian citizens behind the front lines willing to share anything, even like smoke. And we haven't also seen a lot of trains like that loaded up to that extent, that close to the front lines, for just this reason. Lots of train cars loaded up inside of Russia, but they tend to, once they get inside of occupied Ukrainian territory, not be operating in that manner much anymore. But nonetheless, we'll wait to see official confirmation or denial, if anything comes of this actual train attack. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.